You won't believe what Mark Carney is trying to do. He's just made a move that could change Canada forever. And no, I'm not exaggerating. By asking Canada's top court to practically rewrite the most important part of the Canadian Constitution, Section 33, also known as the Notwithstanding Clause, which is a political safety valve for Canadian democracy. And while this has only gotten a bit of coverage in the legacy media, let me tell you, this matters, and it's more important than you may think it is. Because if Mark Carney gets his way, it would not only mean the end of the Canadian Constitution as we know it, but it could bring about an unprecedented constitutional immunity crisis and mean the end of Canada as we know it. Hi, I'm Ellie, and I've been implicated in Canadian politics for about 10 years now, and I've worked as a political journalist for the last 5 years, working for Canada's top independent media outlets. And today, we'll break down Mark Carney's unprecedented push to practically rewrite the Canadian Constitution through the courts, a move that could give unelected judges total and complete power over Canada's laws. And we'll discuss the real consequences that this could have on our country with the help of a prominent constitutional lawyer. But before we get started with this video, like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to not miss the next upload. And now, let's get to it. This is Simply Politics. Journalism and commentary 1 year anniversary. I don't believe journalism being funded by the government is the solution. You have to rebuild the foundation. You have to retell the stories. Other news that actually matters.
I hence wanted to ask. I think they should answer their questions, especially if they're politically charged.
Part 1, all about Section 33. Section 33, also known as the Notwithstanding Clause, is arguably the most important part of the Canadian Constitution. It states that a legislator or the Parliament can decide that a law will stay in place even if a judge strikes it down based on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Notwithstanding what the court says, this law remains in place for 5 years. After that, the government has the opportunity to renew the clause for another 5 years, but in between that time, there is bound to be an election given that those take place every 4 years, and therefore the people, you and me, get to have a say on whether we approve this government's use of the clause. Now, it only applies to certain charter rights, and does not apply to democratic rights, mobility rights, or minority language rights. Meaning that if government were to pass a law, for example, banning elections, well, the clause could not then be used to stop this sort of law. Now, why do we have this, and why is it the most important part of the Canadian Constitution? Well, this clause is a compromise that made the Charter possible in 1982. At the time, some provinces were worried that the Charter was going to lead to judges having too much power within Canada, and that those judges could interpret the Constitution as they wanted and impose their view of the Constitution on everybody, with no way for the politicians and the people to fight back. So the clause was proposed in order to create some important balance. That is what Josh DeHaas, a constitutional lawyer with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, told me.
So Section 33 of the Charter is a section that is essentially a safety valve in a way for governments where courts might find that their laws that they pass violate certain sections of the Charter. So the Notwithstanding Clause is a uniquely Canadian compromise that says that we're going to have courts look at rights and look at individual cases and tell us what they believe the Charter of Rights and Freedoms means. And most of the time, legislatures will stand down, they will listen to the courts, and they will comply with what the Charter says. But it has that safety valve built in as part of the compromise so that at the end of the day, legislatures don't lose all of their power and are able to correct things when judges get things wrong.
Part 2, what Carney is doing. Mark Carney's Liberal government has filed arguments at the Supreme Court, Canada's highest court, in a court case involving Quebec's Bill 21, the Secularism Bill. This is a bill that bans teachers, police officers, judges, and other public servants in positions of authority from wearing religious symbols like hijabs and turbans. Quebec has done this because they want to promote religious neutrality in the public service, meaning that they don't want people to impose their religion on others. Quebec has shielded this law with what is called a preemptive use of the Notwithstanding clause, meaning that it imposed the clause on the law when it passed it, rather than wait for it to be challenged and court struck down and then reintroduce it with the clause. Something that is totally allowed. Mark Carney's Liberal government, continuing with the Liberal Party tradition of supporting multiculturalism, has intervened in a court challenge against this law that is now at the Supreme Court. But they've not just intervened to say that they support the right of public servants in Quebec to wear their hijabs or their turbans. Instead, federal lawyers are asking the Supreme Court of Canada to impose limits on how provincial and even the federal government could use the Notwithstanding clause, could use this democratic safety valve that is meant to put checks and balances on the judicial system. In a statement, Canada's Minister of Justice, Sean Fraser, said, quote, "This case is about more than just the immediate issues before the court. The Supreme Court's decision will shape how both federal and provincial governments may use the Notwithstanding clause for years to come."
The other question that's being raised by Prime Minister Carney himself, much to many surprise, is whether there are certain uses of the Notwithstanding clause that would be unconstitutional entirely. For example, if a province like Quebec, which has repeatedly used the Notwithstanding clause to uphold its language laws, if that may be unconstitutional and simply not allowed by the court. Well, it really matters because it's about who gets to decide what is constitutional at the end of the day.
Part 3, the case against the clause. Now, the Notwithstanding clause has come under fire in recent years, particularly from people on the political left. Now, you may ask yourself, well, shouldn't our rights be absolute? Why should a government be able to overturn a court ruling deciding that the rights have been overturned? Well, as we'll see in a moment, it's not just because there was a historical compromise that was done to prevent judges from having too much power, but actually, if this were to not be the case, there could be some very serious fundamental consequences on Canada. But first, let's look at criticism of the clause. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association argues that the clause has become dangerous. On their website, they note, quote, "If governments can use the charter override without consequence, they won't hesitate to do it time and time again. If our rights and freedoms can easily be overridden, our charter is meaningless." The CCLA wants Parliament and provincial legislators to enact limits on their use of the clause. The limits they want to see Parliament and the legislators enact include no preemptive use, meaning that they don't want the clause to be put on a law before the law is tested in court. 2, they would like there to be a supermajority requirement for the clause to be used. And 3, they believe that the use of the clause for what they consider quote-unquote egregious rights violations should never be allowed to stand. I asked the boss about the concerns brought about by the clause's critics. Here's what he had to say.
If governments just put the Notwithstanding clause in every single act that they pass, and there was a period of time when Quebec did this very thing as a protest to not being on board with the original constitution. If they did it every time, then the charter would be entirely meaningless. People wouldn't have any protection for their rights at all. So, every time a government uses the Notwithstanding clause, Canadians should pay attention, they should be concerned, and they should ask themselves whether this is an instance where governments are using the Notwithstanding clause to override their rights, and they should become part of that discussion and use their democratic vote in the next election if they think it's been done in an instance where it shouldn't have been done.
It should be noted that the clause has only been invoked a handful of times, in fact, much less than once a year. It is very rare, so it's not like the clause is being used every day by politicians to override the charter. It remains a very rare instance. And as the boss stressed, this is a trade-off. If overused, yes, it could end up undermining charter rights, but at the same time, having it makes sure that our judges are kept in check. It balances judicial power with democratic accountability. Author Thomas Sowell once put it that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And here, the trade-offs I think are worth it. And as we're about to see, the trade-offs to not having the notwithstanding clause could be disastrous. Part 4, consequences if rewritten. There are many consequences that would happen if Mark Carney gets his way and if the court rewrites Canada's constitution. The first of which would be that Canada would shift towards judicial supremacy. This essentially means that we would become a country run by judges where the judges have the final say, essentially putting in place an aristocratic elite. Second, judicial activism would accelerate and go unchecked.
Judicial activism is when judges decide that they are going to make laws and try to influence social policy when that's really not their job. But their job is to interpret laws and to decide cases.
Judicial activism is actually a major issue in Canada, and we've seen countless examples of it in the last few years. For example, we've seen judges recognize rights or grant injunctions giving people the right to use drugs in public places, operate drug consumption sites, have the right to use a bike lane that the government wants to take away, and a right to doctor-assisted suicide even when death is not imminent. Canada's Supreme Court also ruled that certain jail sentences for the absolute worst people on earth in this country are somehow cruel and unusual punishments. We've seen judges embrace woke ideology by referring to women as persons with a vagina. The Chief Justice has made political statements. And under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, several Liberal Party donors were appointed to the bench.
The Liberal Party of Canada, they have this tradition of wanting to place a lot of lawmaking power in the hands of judges, and there are a lot of judges that will take hold of that.
Third, this would amount to a backdoor constitutional amendment, meaning a change to the Constitution without the formal process. And if the court sides with Carney, he'll get what he wants. It would erase the essential democratic safety valve without a single Canadian having a say. And you know what? He didn't even run on this during the election. This is completely out of nowhere. And if the Supreme Court does go ahead and do this, it would create two crises. It would create a constitutional crisis, which is when you have a standoff between different parties and there is no more legitimate constitution to resolve the issue, because that constitution in this case will have been politicized and rewritten by the courts, causing anger. This would create a unity crisis. Now, there already is a looming unity crisis in Canada with Alberta and Quebec. And as DeHaas explained, this would just inflame the national unity situation. According to polling, Quebec is set next year to elect back into power the separatist Parti Québécois, whose leader has pledged to have a referendum on Quebec independence. And Alberta is likely to hold an independence referendum next year, with citizens triggering such a vote. Separatist sentiment is rather strong, though not majority, in both places. And all of this momentum and frustration took place before Carney's Supreme Court decision. If it was bad before, just imagine how worse it's going to get. This may all sound unbelievable, but it is happening before our very eyes. The bottom line, this isn't just a court case, it's a battle about who governs Canada. Elected representatives or unelected judges. And I believe that Mark Carney and the Liberals and the Supreme Court need to leave the notwithstanding clause alone. If you agree that Canadians and not elected judges should have the final say over legislation in this country, then please sign the petition in the description telling Carney and the Supreme Court to leave the clause alone. And share this video to inform Canadians about this crucial thing going on right now. And make sure you're subscribed. This video was made possible thanks to generous support from viewers like you. If you would like to support my channel, which does not take a dime from government, unlike the legacy media, then check out the links below. Until next time, God bless. The views expressed by Josh DeHaas are his alone, and the views expressed by me are mine.